afternoon, and thank you all for attending the VSU Undergraduate Research Symposium and this webinar. Please keep in mind that during the session, all mics will be muted. Any questions that you have should be typed in the chat box, and these questions will be given to me to ask the students at the end of the session. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll first have Sarah Ann Carr from the Department of Modern and Classical Language, and the title of her talk is The Exploitation of the Lower Class for the Expansion of Agriculture Perpetuates the Cycle of Poverty for these communities in Latin America. So without any further ado, Sarah.
Thank you. Hola, soy Sara. Bienvenido a mi presentación. Hi, I'm Sarah, and welcome to my presentation. This work is done under the advisement of Dr. Susan Whaling in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. My presentation slides are going to be in Spanish, but I will be speaking in English to be able to communicate with a greater audience. Here is a brief outline of the presentation. I will first give some background information and then discuss how the exploitation of the lower class started with indigenous populations and then African slaves. I'm going to then discuss the expansion of the railroad and how it relates, as well as give an exploitative industry by talking about the banana industry. I'm then going to give a brief overview of where we're at currently before giving my conclusion. So there's nothing more iconic than sitting on a beach in a tropical country drinking a pina colada. It's my favorite, at least, and this pina colada is made from fresh pineapples and coconuts. Once the trip's over, you head back home to the United States, go out to dinner at a restaurant, and you can, once again, order that delicious drink, a frozen cocktail made of fresh pineapples and coconuts. Once you leave, you decide that you need some groceries. So you stop at the grocery store and you're met with an abundance of fresh fruits, including those pineapples, coconuts, bananas, and so many more. But where do these fruits really come from? And how is this fresh fruit available globally at any given time? Even more, what are the implications of this massive industry on the countries and communities that produce these products? At least these are some of the questions that come to my mind. And what I hope to show in this presentation is that the exploitation of the lower class to produce these agricultural products for international corporations perpetuates a cycle of poverty in the communities in which these products are produced. So the main idea is that the fruits are mass produced in one area, but the money is benefiting another. Here is a timeline of what we're going to discuss in the subsequent slides, primarily starting with the 15th century and a little before. And this is when we saw the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. And then we're going to talk about the 16th century with the arrival of the African slaves. What you see here in the timeline is a brief break, and that's because between the 16th century and the 19th century, the African slaves were the primary source of labor until it was abolished in all of Central America in the 19th century. In the 19th century is also where I'm going to talk about the production of the railroad. And then in the 20th, we see a bloody history associated with this industry. And I'm going to talk about the banana wars. And then again, give a brief intro or overview of what's currently happening. So we're going to start with the beginning up through the 16th century. This exploitation that I'm referring to is not a new concept. The communities that produce these products have traditionally been exploited by the upper class. And we've seen this globally, not just in Latin America. We see it in the US, in some of the production of some of our fruits and vegetables. We've seen it in Africa. We've seen it in Asia. So it's not a new concept. But in Latin America, we know that these countries have been producing these agricultural commodities or present day commodities, such as pineapples, papayas, coconuts, cotton, since well before the arrival of the Spaniards in the New World. And once the Spanish arrived, they began establishing their Spanish regime. Los Indios, or the indigenous populations, were enslaved to work for the colonizers. And this kept happening until the numbers dropped too low for those workers to be productive. And by drop too low, I mean they were dying off. Many of Los Indios died by the smallpox, as we know, introduced by the Spaniards coming from the Old World, or they were simply just killed. And once this occurred, the Spanish began importing African slaves to complete the work. The African slaves were there for over 200 years, similarly to what we have seen here in the United States. And then once the slavery ended, the descendants of the slaves still remained in the cycle of poverty and were continuously exploited. That's because when they were freed, there were little resources and they had very few skills to do anything else other than to work on these plantations. Descendants, even to this day, are subjected to racism and classism, and that was originally established during the Spanish regime and the caste systems that occurred. And so I'm going to move in now to talking about the 19th century. Bananas were originally propagated in Southeast Asia, but imported to the New World in the 15th and 16th centuries to be produced in these large quantities on the plantations. And then from there, they soon expanded exponentially to become one of the main fruits exported from Latin America. What happened in 1871 with Keith Minor, an American, came in and built the first railroad in Costa Rica. And the objective was to have this railroad and plant bananas along the railroad to better facilitate the transportation of those bananas to the coast or to the ports to be exported. They were then exported to the United States and Europe due to an increase in demand from those countries at that time. Minor, again, he was American, and he and his colleagues, Lorenzo Baker, Andrew Preston, they formed what we know, or what was originally called the Boston Fruit Company. From there, it was soon renamed as the United Fruit Company, and is currently known as Chiquita Brands International. And Chiquita is who I'm going to use as an example. Please note that throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to the company as Chiquita or Chiquita Brands, irregardless of the time period I'm referring to as it relates to their names. So the industry then began to expand. And when it did this, it was in gross capacities, and it was based on the disproportionate ownership of land. What we saw are that these companies, such as Chiquita, would come in and buy the land from the locals and force them to move out. When the locals moved out, they had nowhere to go. And so then Chiquita would offer employment back to the locals at a very low wage, well below the living wage, to create this kind of cheap export. But the other reality was, if the locals did not choose to sell, then they were forced to abandon their property. And in that case, they still had nothing to do and nowhere to go. So they became itinerant farmers, which allowed for the imposition of this capitalistic development. This picture is a picture of a banana plantation in Honduras taken in 1894. The mistreatment in these poor conditions led to what is known as the Banana Wars that occurred between 1898 and 1934. Workers would basically protest against the corporations, particularly Chiquita, because it was the dominating company at the time. Chiquita, as you know, was founded by a man from the United States, and they were located in the United States. So they then lobbied the US government to intervene in this multinational banana war. And they did this to protect their own interests. The two things they were concerned primarily were protecting was, one, the trade passages, and two, They wanted to control the workers, or basically get them back to work, because this was affecting productivity overall. The interactions of the workers and the governments, both local and the United States government, often got quite violent. And an example I want to show of this violence was the Colombian Plantation Massacre of 1928. It happened in Macondo, Colombia, and this was on a Chiquita plantation where the workers were protesting for 6-day work weeks, shorter work days, and they wanted to be paid in money and not in company coupons, which to me, that's not an unreasonable ask. But as you saw previously, or as I just discussed, Chiquita had such close ties with the US government, and due to the US already being involved in the banana wars, they went in and put pressure on the Colombian government to remedy the situation. As a result, the Colombian government sent their military in and massacred all of the protesters, killing over 1,000 Colombians in that day. And sadly, we've seen this cycle in many countries. We've seen issues in Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama. But I don't have enough time to discuss them. So if you guys want to, talk to me online after the presentation, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation. One thing I do want to take a moment to point out is that this picture are the 5 leaders of the banana plantation worker strike. And out of respect, this is Pedro Del Rio. This is Bernardino Guerrero. This is Raul Eduardo Mahecha. This is Nicanor Serrano. And this is Erasmo Coronel. And now I'm going to go on and give a brief overview of where we're at today. This is a map of the New World, North and South America, basically. And what we see is here I've placed these small bananas on countries that Chiquita Brands currently has banana plantations. We have Honduras, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador, Colombia, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Peru. But the headquarters of Chiquita is currently located in Charlotte, North Carolina. So hence the money sign on the United States. Chiquita, though, in 2015 was acquisitioned by 2 Brazilian companies, Suco Cítrico Culturale Group and the Safra Group. And so what we see also is that a major portion of the profits are going to Brazil. And again, all the production is occurring in Latin America. Of note, Joseph Safra of the Safra Group is Brazil's richest man with a net worth of $19.9 billion. And Jose Luis Culturale has a net worth of $2.5 billion. But if we turn around and we look at the workers, we see that their salaries are still very low. Unionized workers can make an equivalent of $10 US per day, and they'll have some benefits of about $10 US more. They have a little bit of access. So these benefits are some access to healthcare, schools for the kids, and then also some housing. But these are still much lower, are not quite adequate for what we would consider for developed countries such as the United States, or even some of the more populated or urban areas in these developing countries. But even sadly, there are non-union banana workers, and they make up to $3 US per day. They have no benefits and no voice at work. The communities still live in poverty. They still have poor conditions, are subject to harsh environmental conditions. But one of the greatest problems is that they are subject to large amounts of chemicals, basically on a daily basis. We see these chemicals as in fertilizers, herbicides, and fungicides. And I've depicted this in the pictures a little bit. So this picture here is one way that fungicides are basically spread to banana plantations. It's basically aerosolized. And it's very dangerous for the workers that work directly in these fields, because the fungicides have been linked to thyroid dysfunction disorders, which means basically they are disrupting the hormone communications within the body. On the top right, we see a worker curing bananas in these bags. They're industry standard bags that are laced with insecticides, as well as compounds that help aid in the ripening process. And these chemicals that they're exposed to are readily absorbed across the skin. And then I just wanted to point out down here, this is a picture from Costa Rica, and where some protests have still occurred. This one was from 2015, and we've seen some rather large protests occurring in 2015, 2013 in Costa Rica and Panama. And so to give a brief overview and conclusion, since the arrival of Columbus to the New World, the lower class has been exploited for agricultural production. So these populations that were exploited were the indigenous communities, the African slaves, and then of course the lower class. The expansion of the railroad facilitated this ability for exponential growth of the industry. And over time, there have been many unsuccessful attempts to rectify these poor working conditions, as we see with the protests, the uprisings. Although some progress has been made, and that's of note, there still remains this perpetual cycle of poverty in these Latin American communities. All right, and thank you. Or I am finished.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. There are some questions that some have for you. So from Dr. Laverne, her question is, we'll hold it until the end. I apologize for that. So we'll have the next presentation. So the next presentation is from Kim Fromkin, who is from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And the title of her talk is Mary, the Mother of God, A Night of Faith and Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. Kim, you may go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Randolph. Thank you so much to the Undergraduate Research Symposium for giving me the opportunity today to present this. My name is Kim Fromkin. I'm a senior here at Valdosta State University, majoring in philosophy and religious studies. Last semester, I had the opportunity to take a class with Dr. Laverne, who I also would like to thank for being my mentor on this project. Existentialism was a pretty difficult class to try to understand with all the language and theories, but I chose to do my research on Soren Kierkegaard, excuse me, mainly his Fear and Trembling. So the title of my presentation is Mary, the Mother of God, A Night of Faith in Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard discusses what it means to be human, what it means to have human existence, mainly with the relationship between the finite and the infinite, and how this relationship between the finite and the infinite relates to what he calls the paradox of faith. He explains this paradox of faith with two identities. One is the night of resignation, and the other is the night of faith, by using the biblical characters of Abraham and Mary. And traditionally in Christianity, Abraham has been recognized as the father of faith, while Mary has been recognized as, some claim, the mother of Jesus, some claim the mother of God, some claim the mother of the Son of God. As I began my research, I found that there was an abundance of information on Abraham being a knight of faith, but very little on Mary. There were maybe three or four at the most, scholarly writings and articles on Mary being a Kierkegaardian knight of faith. And anytime I would look up Kierkegaard knight of faith, it was always Abraham, 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 Abraham. And so that made me question why scholars had left Mary out of this discussion, especially in the 21st century. So I sought to investigate this further. So my primary source on this was Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and then I had secondary resources using Claire Carlisle, Sylvia Crocker, Andrew Cross, and Edmund Centuri, and then there were some others as well. trying to find out if Mary does fit this mode or this model or this archetype of a knight of faith, if she's just as much a knight of faith as Abraham, if not more. So the first thing I sought to do was to look at faith as being a paradox. Kierkegaard's definition of faith on the paradox of faith was multidimensional. He begins that faith is the paradox that the single individual is higher than the universal. It's something that cannot be explained in words. And someone who walks in this paradox of faith has no one to advise him or no one to understand him. He also says that faith is a marvel and it's a passion that unites all humanity. Another dimension of this paradox is that interiority is higher than exteriority, which is also an absolute duty to God involving distresses, anxieties, and it leads to unethical behaviors. Claire Carlyle claimed that Kierkegaard's concept of faith involves a lifelong task of absurdity, receptivity, and responsiveness, and it involves activity, exertion, and decision on the individual's part. She also claimed that for Kierkegaard, faith was an inward phenomenon, not based on beliefs or emotions, but is what one does. So there are two archetypes of faith. There's the knight of resignation, and then there is the knight of faith. So first, dealing with the knight of resignation, Kierkegaard says that this archetype of faith is one who empties themselves out of all that is finite for the infinite. Sylvia Crocker claims that the individual is concerned with the infinite movement of renunciation, where they renounce all claims to what is earthly. And this is done by the individual, it doesn't require a supernatural act. So therefore, they're not necessarily depending on God because they're giving something up that they can do on their own. Andrew Cross claims that the knight of resignation has to do with one becoming their infinitized self, meaning that they are expressing their love for the eternal being, which is a transcendent God. For Adams, the knight of resignation gains an eternal consciousness as their love for God is expressed in the individual giving up what is most dear to them. Now, in looking at the second archetype, which is the knight of faith, Kierkegaard claims that this archetype is one who is courageous. They give themselves up for the universal and they are not afraid of solitude. He claims that their life is like a book under divine confiscation. He also says that they are often silent because their distresses and anguishes cannot be spoken in human words. Crocker says that this person is not concerned with their future as they are God and God's determination for their future. This person is involved with the double movement from the finite to the infinite and then from the infinite back to the finite. So not only do they sacrifice something of extreme importance, but they are also able to receive it back again as a gift, even though that gift may not look the same as what they renounced or what they gave up. This person also has learned to listen to God in silence. For Adams, he says that Kierkegaard sought to explain how an individual can understand one's devotion to God, how it can coexist with finitude while maintaining their relationship with the absolute. So in first looking at the biblical example of Abraham, Kierkegaard says that Abraham had faith because he simply existed. Now, Centuri, using Kierkegaard's work, says that Abraham's act of faith in placing his son on the altar as a sacrifice was a teleological suspension of the ethical because his faithful actions transgressed all that was moral and all that was ethical. This act of faith was homicidal. It violated the relationship between the father and his son and humanity. Carlyle comes in and says that Abraham's faith was a faith without religion, doctrines, institutions, or a religious community. It was more about a relationship with God than it was about his own wills and desires of having his promised son. Crocker says that Abraham renounced his greatest possession, which was his one and only son, his promise, because he was not concerned whether God would give him his son back or not. Instead, his focus was God's divine plan. Centauri says that Abraham was silent amid inner turmoil, and that he must remain silent about his act because he was unable to categorize it. He was unable to express his act in words, which by that very nature was universal. Centauri also claimed that Abraham remains a radical subject isolated in a realm beyond comprehensibility, beyond the universal, and beyond the ethical. Carlyle circles back around and says, well, Abraham was silent because he was listening from within. He was not overwhelmed with emotion or anxiety, and because of that, he was able to hear God tell him to sacrifice a ram instead of his son. So what made Abraham a knight of faith was the fact that he was able to receive his son for a second time. So it wasn't a matter of just the sacrifice and giving up something that he loved. He had to be willing to receive his son, the promise of his son, back again. Now, in looking at Mary, the other biblical example that Kierkegaard references, he asked the question, in dealing with Mary, he asked the question. He says, who was as great in the world as that favored woman, the mother of God, the Virgin Mary? He further asks, how do we even speak of her? He claims that no one could understand Mary because the extraordinary was happening to her. He also claimed that the one whom God blesses, he curses in the same breath. Mary was not this fine lady who sits and plays with an infant God. Instead, Kierkegaard says that when she said, behold, the handmaid of the Lord, that was when she became great. And he says, I think it will not be difficult to explain why she became the mother of God. Becoming the mother of God as a virgin required divine assistance. This was not something she could do on her own. Dara Sight says that Mary was remarkable because she had faith in the paradox. She was blessed with a divine child, but she was also cursed because she was unmarried in a day and age where women did not have sex outside of marriage. It went against her cultural ethical order. Mulder says that Mary chose to become nothing, to be scorned by others and treated as a frivolous, conceited wench or a poor, half-crazy wretch or a loose woman, and so on. He also says that her willingness to accept her role in the paradox would expose her to much disgrace and would present lifelong conflicts within her culture. Carlyle says that Mary's suffering was incomprehensible as it was a constant choice to give up and receive God's promises despite the odds. She was consistently vulnerable. She lived in silence all the days of her life. Stillness was linked to her transparency that characterized the God relationship between her and the infinite. In looking at what the parallels between Kierkegaard's Abraham, knight of faith, and Kierkegaard's Mary as a knight of faith, both Mary and Abraham faced the existential act of choosing the infinite over the finite and God's will over their own lives. Both had to deal with the agonies of being a knight of faith and all that comes with that. Both examples represented a sense of silence and stillness, and both made sacrifices, and both were able to receive back what they gave up. However, the differences, on the other hand, is that Mary did not only agree to obey what was unethical, she did the unethical. She gave birth to a child outside of wedlock. She went against her culture. She not only sacrificed herself, her reputation, and her family's reputation, but she also had to face the sacrifice of her son later, who would be deemed by some as the Messiah, which was considered blasphemy. Abraham's sacrificial journey consisted of 3 days up Mount Moriah. Mary's was multidimensional, and it was lifelong. There could have been much speculation as to how Abraham's child was killed if he did indeed go through with that sacrifice, as there were no witnesses. Mary's illegitimate pregnancy was exposed to everyone. Everyone knew that she was not married, and everyone knew that she was having a child. So Mary being pregnant with the Son of God in her womb was a blasphemous act, as they were Jews, not Christians, and this idea was completely absurd. In conclusion, I decided, based on the research that I found, that Mary is just as much a knight of faith as Abraham, if not more. She lived in silence. Her faith was an ongoing demonstration. She did not make one sacrifice, but she made many. Kierkegaard's discussion of Mary and her willingness to exchange the finite for the infinite placed Mary above Abraham as a knight of faith. She had to sacrifice her finite self to become pregnant with the infinite. The example of Mary being a knight of faith opens the possibility for other women to be knights of faith as well. So again, I circle back to the question of, if these things be true, and if this is something that Kierkegaard points out, then why is it in the 21st century that Mary has been left out of this discussion? Being that Mary is illustrated in Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling as one who is extraordinary, she simply is displayed as a knight of faith, which means that there are other women who can also be knights of faith. Thank you very much. This concludes my presentation, and here is a list of my sources. Thank you once again.
Thank you for your presentation, Kim. We will now have Q&A from your audience. So I'll begin with a question for Sarah. Sarah, this question comes from Chastity Hamilton. Is there a push towards livable wages, or are these wages considered acceptable in these places due to a varying cost of living?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chastity. So, no. And part of the problem is that many of these countries don't have a minimum wage. And so a lot of the wages determined are determined by collective bargaining or by negotiation, and are strictly set by the companies. I don't know exact numbers for all countries, but I do know some numbers for Costa Rica. And so it's kind of normal or average to see someone making about $450 US per day in Costa Rica. And if you want to, or not per day, sorry, per month, excuse me. And if you want to look at this based on unionized versus non-unionized banana workers from my presentation, you would see a unionized worker making about $300 per month. So that's quite less. But then you would see a non-unionized worker not even making $100 per month. And so it's still well below what would be considered a livable wage.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. The next question is for Kim. Kim, this question comes from Precious. Do you think that not much is written about Mary regarding to faith due to patriarchy?
Yes, absolutely. I was looking at the questions, and I think her question ties in with Dr. Lovern's question. And I think that Kierkegaard, in my research on Kierkegaard, he seemed to follow along with the Christian doctrines, but there was a time when he walked away from the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Christianity, and I think based on the research that I did that he moved past that. And so we're looking at the 1800s. Well, even today in the 21st century, there's an old saying, there's proof in the pudding. And I think that patriarchy is still something that is ever present in Christianity and some of your more Orthodox Christian circles. And I think that this is why she is not. One thing that did spark my interest was the fact that there's plenty of material on Mary being the mother of God, on Mary's role in the Trinity, even with God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It seems to be a little bit more like on the Catholic Christian side, but again, I thought it was just really interesting that there was not a lot of information on her being a knight of faith, which tells me that patriarchy is still happening. It's still.
Okay, I think she finished. I'm not sure if her internet went out. but if she comes again, we'll let her finish. The next question we have will be for Kim. So Kim, this is from.
I'm still here. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm still here.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I did finish. My internet is in and out, but I did finish. Sorry about that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we'll go ahead and have a question for Sarah. All right, Sarah, this is from Dr. Laverne. I was wondering if you have had a chance to look at claims that the global north continues to exploit the global south to keep the global south as exploited workers.
So I will state that I am not an expert in that whole ideal, but I am familiar with it. And I absolutely agree to an extent. But when you add agriculture in it, one thing you have to look at is not simply, kind of north or south, but you got to look at whether or not they are developed agriculturally, meaning that countries that are developed agriculturally all have a temperate climate in at least part of their country or their borders. And so in history, what we've seen is the ones with temperate climates are the ones who've been able to kind of form their economy earlier, and that helped lead to being able to produce enough become developed in our present days, if that makes sense. And so we're not necessarily looking at strictly a north or south issue because, of course, we have countries like Australia, New Zealand, very big agricultural countries, not a lot of exploited labor there, though there is some arguments for the indigenous populations and Asians that come to work. But one specific example I do want to point out is South Africa. It is considered a developed country agriculturally, and it does have a temperate climate. And we've seen a lot of genocide and a lot of kind of racism and exploitation that occurred there as well as the neighboring countries. And so I think, yes, I completely agree with the standpoint, but there's also a layer of complication when you're looking at it purely from an agricultural standpoint.
Thank you, Sarah. Kim, this question is for you from Dr. Laverne. Why do you think that Kay uses Mary, but others have ignored Mary? And why so many scholars still claim Mary can't be a knight of faith?
I think that that question goes back to what I answered previously, and I think it has to do with patriarchy continuing today, and in the United States. That's what I think. I think that Mary is a knight of faith. I think that she has been ignored. I think that she has been ignored mainly because of patriarchy. Although another question that rose was, well, you have a lot of feminist scholars now, and I've worked with some women in gender studies classes and other courses that I've taken and other research papers that I have written, and there seemed to be more work on some other topics and not this one. And so I'm not really quite sure why even some feminist scholars haven't tackled this question. I mean, maybe it's time to do that. Maybe that's something I'm supposed to do. But thank you for that question.
Excellent. Maybe you should hop on that. So the next question is for Sarah. Sarah, this is from Danielle. You mentioned a few worker strikes during your presentation. Do you think there is any potential for a wider spread mass protest in the industry?
Absolutely. There's always the potential, and until the consumer demand shifts, then we're not going to see a difference in the production, right? Because we're feeding this industry, and the way it works, the prices are low. We get products very quickly, and so unless consumers were to stand up and say no, then it's not going to work. But if you look at it from a worker standpoint, to an extent, the strikes could work, but at the same time, it's still dangerous. It's not even been many years where we've seen various government entities still go in and kill people in different countries. And if you want to talk more about that, you can get with me after the presentation. And so it would still have to be careful. And I think a lot of it has to do with the consumer side of it more than the worker side of it. Let's see. Another thing that needs to occur is there basically needs to be policy changes, both in our country, but also in the countries where they are working. And again, it's not going to change unless consumer perception changes and the company's policy changes. So I think it's a very difficult situation to remedy, I guess you could say.
Thank you, Sarah. This question is for Kim. This is from Chastity. How would you respond to those who say that Mary received the supernatural when Abraham did not? Abraham was over 100 years old when his wife bore him his son. This would be more possible today with technological advances, but not then.
Yes, okay, thank you for that question. I think I've been reading this question and thinking of how I would answer this, and I think this question is multidimensional. First of all, let me say that Abraham was a knight of faith, and what Kierkegaard brings up more so than the fact that Sarah and Abraham were both, very old, and it was a miracle for them to have their child. That was the promise, and it was miraculous. I think that there are layers. I think that there are dimensions to what Kierkegaard says based on the terms that he uses. And he can call Abraham extraordinary. He says about Mary, he says the extraordinary is happening to her. So if he says the extraordinary is happening to her, why did he not say the same thing as the extraordinary is happening to Abraham? I think it was extraordinary. I think the fact that they were having a child, in their older age was quite miraculous. I think what Kierkegaard hones in on is the fact of the night of resignation, which is where he travels alone with his son, and he has to sacrifice the most precious thing to him, the very promise, the thing that him and Sarah waited for, the thing that they held on to God for 60, 70 something years that didn't seem to come. So he does this night of resignation where he is renouncing the son, and then as the ram is there in the thicket, he is able to go through and receive his son back again, knowing that God made him that promise. Mary, on the other hand, I think that it's a different layer. I won't say that the extraordinary didn't happen to both of them. I would not say that both of them did not receive miracles, but I think it might have been a bigger deal to Kierkegaard that Mary was impregnated not just as a virgin. Yes, that's a miracle, just like Abraham being 100 years old having a child. Sarah, same way. I don't know that that was necessarily his point. I think his point was not so much that Mary was having an illegitimate, pregnancy in the cultural constructs. I think it was more along the lines of she was carrying God. She was carrying the infinite. I think that's why he hones in on her and says, what can we even say about her? He couldn't say anything about her. So I hope that answers your question. I think that it's multidimensional, but thanks for asking that.
Thank you for your response, Kim. This question is for both of you. We'll have Sarah answer first. Were there did anything surprise you in your research?
Yes, thank you. So from a general standpoint, looking at the industry, no, I was already familiar with the banana industry as well as the cocoa industry, pineapples, etc. I've been to Costa Rica and been on some of these plantations as well as through various Caribbean islands that produce these products. What did surprise me, though, was the role the United States had in manipulating or basically in going in and kind of siding with different governments to better control the workers, if that makes sense. And if you take time and wanted to Google it or talk with me later, there is a lot of evidence out there where the United States got quite violent. And so some of that was not unexpected in terms of unbelievable, but unexpected in terms of I didn't think that it was that bad, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Sarah. Now we'll have Kim respond to the same question. Did you find anything surprising in your research?
I think I've covered that as well. That the most, this is what gave me basically the for my research was the fact that I could not find information on Mary. But I want to make this point, and that is this: that even though Kierkegaard is talking about a topic that is religious and mainly Christian and mainly Orthodox Christianity, Kierkegaard was a philosopher as well. And it also surprises me that philosophers, even non-religious philosophers, have not brought Mary up even close to the scholarship that I have found on Mary. So this doesn't just tell me that, or pose the question, is patriarchy just in, Christian religious circles? It also makes me ask the question, is patriarchy continuing in philosophical circles? So this is surprising to me. This was very surprising. I honestly, I couldn't believe it. We're in the 21st century, and there's little scholarship on her. Like, what has happened? So the whole thing was mind-boggling for me. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next question, we have time for maybe one more question. So this question is for Sarah from Dr. Swan. I remember the American boycotts of raisins in the U.S. in the early 80s, and was wondering if you think a banana boycott in the U.S. would be an effective strategy.
I think it can be, if it is organized and employed in a somewhat effective and synchronous manner. But I also think it may be bigger than the U.S. to need to be able to change overall perception so that the companies want to change their policies. So yes, I do think it could be effective, but I think it would be quite difficult. And so we do see somewhat of a shift in consumer demands when we switch to, say, organic versus not. And that alleviates some of the problem in terms of the chemicals, but we still do not see a great improvement in the pay and the living conditions. And so I think it would have to be very coordinated and employed very strategically to be able to, for it to be effective.
Thank you. I think this was a really good session. Thank you guys for your presentations and enlightening us with information some of us may or may not have had before. Thank you to the audience for attending this webinar session. It is now being concluded.